I was grabbing coffee with an old colleague recently, someone I've always respected for his sharp analytical mind. He started telling me about a strategic adjustment he'd made on a major contract. Essentially, he buried a massive calculation error in the fine print to protect his department's year-end bonus. As he spoke, there wasn't a hint of guilt or a tremor in his voice. Instead, he looked almost enlightened. He leaned in and said, "Look, in this market, rigid honesty isn't a virtue, it's a liability. I'm not lying. I'm just managing the narrative for the greater good of my team." He had a whole vocabulary for it. He didn't see a moral lapse, he saw a logical necessity. He kept using words like context, pragmatism, and modern reality. To him, the traditional concept of a sin was just an outdated emotional weight that he had successfully rationalized away. He seemed genuinely proud of his ability to navigate the gray areas that slower, more sentimental people couldn't handle. I mentioned that a junior associate had recently used a similar strategic adjustment to bypass my friend's own approval process on a different project. In an instant, the cool, rational philosopher vanished. He turned red, slammed his espresso cup down, and started venting about a complete lack of basic integrity and how the youth today have no moral compass. That instantaneous shift from championing situational ethics to screaming about absolute betrayal the moment he became the victim was staggering. It wasn't about logic at all. Watching him, I realized his sophisticated arguments weren't tools for finding the truth. They were just a high-tech shield designed to keep his own conscience quiet. It made me wonder, have we become so rational that we've simply learned how to manufacture a sense of righteousness while doing exactly what we know is wrong?
Wow. That's a profound story, isn't it? And what strikes me most, what you just described, is the physical reaction, the slamming of the cup, his face turning red.
It was instantaneous.
That visceral shift.
Yeah.
It reveals that his whole philosophy wasn't really a philosophy at all. It was a defense mechanism, a really elaborate one.
It was like watching a magic trick where the illusion just suddenly shattered. One minute, he's this enlightened pragmatist, floating above the sentimental rules that the rest of us have to follow. Mm-hmm. And the next minute, the very second those rules are broken against him, he becomes the most rigid, old-fashioned moralist in the room.
And that hypocrisy right there is what we really need to dissect today.
Yeah.
Because it is so easy to look at your friend and just say, oh, he's a hypocrite, or he's just a bad apple.
Sure, dismiss him.
Right. But the research we've pulled together for this deep dive suggests something far more uncomfortable. He isn't an anomaly. He's actually demonstrating a cognitive feature that is hardwired into almost all of us. We are going to be talking about moral rationalization.
Rationalization. It's a word we throw around a lot, usually to accuse someone of just making excuses. But in the context of this research, it feels like a much more active process. It's not just making an excuse after the fact. It's like you're actually restructuring reality in your own mind. Is that right?
If we look at some of the foundational work by social psychologists like Elliot Aronson or Ziva Kunda, they paint this picture of human cognition that is very different from how we like to see ourselves. We like to think we're scientists.
Right. We're logical.
We think we are. We think we encounter a situation, say a calculation error in a contract, and we weigh the evidence, we look at the moral rules, and then we make a decision. We think we're truth seekers.
Okay, so I see the error, I see the rule that says don't lie, and I sort of calculate my next move based on that.
Yeah. But Kunda and others argue that we are not scientists, our ears.
Intuitive lawyer. Okay, I really want to dig into that metaphor because that explains so much of what I saw in that coffee shop.
Well, think about what a lawyer actually does. A lawyer's first job is to represent a client. And in your brain, the client is your desire.
My desire.
Your desire. The client is, I want that year-end bonus, or
sure,
I don't want to look incompetent in front of my boss. That conclusion, I must protect the bonus, is decided before the trial in your head even starts. The lawyer's job isn't to find out if the client is guilty or innocent.
No, the lawyer's job is to win the case.
To win the case. The job is to scour the evidence, find the loopholes, reinterpret the law, maybe suppress a few inconvenient witnesses in your memory, all to build a case that allows the client, your desire, to go free.
So when my friend said he was managing the narrative, that was his inner lawyer giving the closing arguments.
And here is the crucial, almost scary part. A good lawyer comes to believe their own closing argument. Your friend wasn't consciously lying to you. In that moment, he had genuinely convinced himself that rigid honesty was a liability. He had reconstructed his entire moral universe so that hiding the error wasn't a crime. It was an act of strong leadership. It was pragmatism.
That is genuinely terrifying because if he believes it, then he doesn't feel any guilt. The high-tech shield, as I called it, it actually works.
It works perfectly. Until, of course, someone else uses the exact same logic against him, then the shield shatters and all that raw, unprocessed emotion comes flooding out. But for our deep dive today, we want to take this concept of the intuitive lawyer, and we want to scale it up. We aren't just talking about one guy and his bonus.
Right.
We're going to look at how this mechanism, this ability to manufacture righteousness on the fly, is reshaping our entire society.
And we've structured this around 3 specific areas. We're going to look at the bureaucracy and the elite, then the economy, and finally the culture. And in each one, we see the same pattern emerging. People using very sophisticated, intelligent-sounding language to justify eroding the very standards that are supposed to hold us all together.
And the cost is incredibly high. We're talking about, the dissolution of trust, the death of meritocracy, and maybe even the fracturing of our shared reality.
Hypocrisy. We have a story here that I think really illustrates how this plays out in the halls of power.
Julian's story is the perfect entry point, I think, because it deals with that very seductive idea of the greater good.
So Julian is a senior policy advisor in Brussels. Imagine a man who has spent 30 years deep inside the machinery of the European Union. He's not some, mustache-twirling villain. He's a true believer in the project of European cooperation. In his mind, the institution is the ultimate safeguard against the chaos of history.
He sees himself as a guardian, a protector of that order.
Exactly. But then a crisis hits his desk. A massive data breach has exposed the private information of millions of citizens. This wasn't some sophisticated cyber attack by a foreign enemy.
Oh.
It was caused by a technical shortcut his own department had authorized to speed up digital integration. They cut corners to meet a deadline, and the whole digital wall just collapsed.
So it's a clear-cut case of internal negligence. There's no one else to blame.
And the protocol is crystal clear. You report the breach immediately. You notify the public. Standard procedure. But Julian is sitting there in his glass-walled office, and he's looking at the latest polling numbers. There is a very volatile election coming up. Anti-institution sentiment is already dangerously high, and he starts to game it out. He imagines the headlines, the public anger, the potential for this news to destabilize the union at a critical moment.
And the intuitive lawyer in his head gets to work.
It goes into overdrive. Julian drafts a memo, but he doesn't frame it as, let's lie to the public. He frames it as a need to contextualize the event. He argues, in a very professional, very high-level language, that the greater moral imperative is to maintain public trust during this critical election cycle.
So telling the truth becomes the irresponsible option.
In his narrative, yes. Admitting the error isn't honesty. It becomes a strategic risk that could empower populist forces he sees as dangerous. He genuinely convinces himself that protecting the institution's reputation is a higher form of morality than telling the truth to individual citizens about their own data.
And what's the end result for him, personally? How does he feel after he hits send on that memo that starts the cover-up?
He feels calm. He feels like he's done his duty. He sleeps soundly that night, believing he's a statesman who made a tough call. But the reality is, by trying to prevent cynicism, he has become the very agent of the thing he fears. He has just dissolved the objective standard of accountability.
This creates a condition that sociologists have a name for. It's called anomie.
Anomie, that's a French term, right? I've seen it translated as normlessness.
Yes, normlessness or lawlessness. But it's deeper than just breaking the law. It's a societal condition. It's a breakdown of the social bonds between the individual and the community. It's that feeling when the rules just don't seem to apply anymore, or they don't bind us together.
So it's a loss of faith in the system.
And Julian's behavior is a textbook example of a concept developed by the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, a really powerful idea called Adiaphorization.
Adiaphorization. I had to look into the etymology of this one myself. It comes from the Greek adiaphoron, is that right?
Correct. Adiaphoron, which means indifferent things. In early theology, it referred to actions or items that weren't essential to salvation. Does the priest wear a red robe or a green one? It's morally indifferent.
Okay.
But Bauman takes this old theological concept and applies it to modern bureaucracy with devastating effect. He uses it to describe the process where human actions are stripped of their moral significance.
So an action isn't good or bad anymore, it's something else.
It moves completely out of the moral realm and into the purely technical realm. In a bureaucracy like Julian's, the key question shifts from, is this right, to is this authorized, or is this efficient, Or is this cost-effective?
See, so Julian isn't even asking himself, do I have a moral right to hide this data from millions of people?
No, that question doesn't even compute in his new framework. He's asking, does this memo serve the technical goal of maintaining stability? He has successfully adiaphorized the data breach. He's made it a matter of process management, not a question of ethics.
This connects directly to another one of Bauman's big ideas, the metaphor of the gardening state. I found this image really, really powerful.
It is one of the most important metaphors for understanding modern power, I think. Bauman says that the modern state, the modern bureaucracy, views society as a garden to be cultivated. Now think about a gardener. When a gardener sees a weed, they don't look at it with hatred. They don't think, this weed is evil. They don't wonder, does this weed have a family? Does it have a right to grow here?
They just look at the overall design of the garden and say, this thing doesn't fit here, it's out of place.
It disrupts the harmony, it reduces the yield of the flowers, so you pull it out. It's a technical act, a design choice, not a moral one. And Julian, in his role, looks at the citizenry not as individuals with inalienable rights, but as a population to be managed.
A crop to be tended.
Exactly. And if the truth, the news of the data breach, would disrupt his garden, cause panic, or ruin the design of the upcoming election, then the truth is a weed, and you remove it.
And you can feel good about it because you're tending the garden, you're being a responsible manager.
You feel virtuous, you're maintaining order. This is why Julian feels that calm. He is experiencing what researchers in business ethics now call ethical fading. The moral colors of the decision, the bright red flag of lying, the simple black and white of truth, they just fade away until everything is just a shade of administrative gray.
But let's go back to the consequence, enemy. Because there is such a profound irony here. Julian thinks he is protecting the social contract by hiding this, but isn't he actually just shredding it?
He is detonating it from within. The social contract, at its core, relies on the idea that the rules apply to everyone. If I sign a contract, I must honor it. If the government collects my data, they have a duty to secure it. When the elites, the people running the garden, decide that they are exempt from these rules because of context or pragmatism,
It becomes rules for thee, but not for me. Or context for me, I guess.
Exactly. And once the public realizes that the game is rigged, that the gardeners don't have to follow the same rules they set for all the plants, trust evaporates. And when trust evaporates, you don't get stability. You get the very populism and anger that Julian was trying to avoid in the first place.
It's a total self-fulfilling prophecy. By rationalizing the lie to prevent cynicism, he creates a world where the truth no longer matters, which is the ultimate source of cynicism.
And that is the unique danger of this kind of elite rationalization. It doesn't just harm individuals, it destroys the objective standards that are required for any kind of social cohesion.
So that's the view from the top, from the bureaucratic heights. But this isn't just a government problem, is it? It's trickling down, or maybe it's just happening in parallel in the economy, in the way we work, the way we compete, the way we get paid. This brings us to our second story, which takes place in the engine room of modern capitalism, Silicon Valley.
Right, let's look at how this plays out in the economy segment.
This is the story of Marcus. I read this account on one of those anonymous forums for tech insiders, one of those places where people can vent about the reality behind the ping pong tables and the free kombucha.
Right.
So Marcus is a software engineer. He's a smart guy, has a family. He works at a very prestigious firm.
Sure.
And his team is falling behind. The quarterly performance metrics, the numbers that determine their bonuses, their next round of funding, maybe even their jobs, they aren't looking good. But his manager doesn't call a meeting and tell them to work harder. The manager calls a meeting and starts talking about correcting for systemic bias.
There's the intuitive lawyer language again.
It's the exact same mechanism.
Yeah.
The manager argues that the algorithm they use to measure their performance is inherently flawed. It doesn't account for the unique challenges the team faced, that market headwinds, staffing shortages, the unusual complexity of the code. He tells the team that because they are working on world-changing technology, they deserve the funding and bonuses that only high metrics would provide. So he instructs them to manually adjust the data.
He frames fraud as a form of fairness.
And Marcus was, horrified at first. He knew it was cooking the books. But then he started to think. He has a mortgage. He has 2 kids he needs to put through school. He looked around the room at his teammates, people he genuinely liked, people who also had families to support. And he started to rationalize.
Started building his own case.
He told himself that his individual integrity, his personal desire to be honest, shouldn't come at the cost of his entire team's livelihood, especially in what he saw as an unfair economic climate.
So he reframed his own honesty as a form of selfishness.
He convinced himself that refusing to cheat would actually be a betrayal of his friends and colleagues. The story goes on to say that within a year, the meritocratic culture of that office had completely evaporated. Why work harder when you can simply narrate your way to a bigger bonus? The objective standard of excellence was replaced by a competition of who could craft the most sympathetic justification for their own mediocrity.
This is a textbook case of what we call the social cocoon.
A cocoon. It sounds protective, almost cozy.
It is protective, but in a really malignant way. A social cocoon is a microculture that forms within a larger organization. Inside that cocoon, the group creates its own reality. They develop their own moral norms that are distinct from and often directly opposed to the outside world.
So they're insulated.
Totally insulated. Marcus's team, in their mind, they aren't lying to shareholders. They are correcting for bias. They aren't committing fraud. They are securing the resources they deserve to continue their important work.
The source material we have for this lists some specific neutralizers, these psychological tools that groups like this use to basically kill their own conscience. I want to break these down because I think we've all probably used them at some point in our lives, even on a small scale.
Absolutely. They are universal. The first big one is denial of injury. In Marcus's case, the logic is, look, it's just numbers in a spreadsheet. It's just an algorithm. Who is physically bleeding? Who is starving because I changed a 4 to a 5?
No harm, no foul. It's a victimless crime, essentially.
Well, exactly. Because the victim is abstract. You know, the shareholders, the market, the crime itself starts to feel abstract and unreal. And then you have the appeal to higher loyalties. This is the one that really hooked Marcus.
I did it for my family defense, the classics.
I'm not doing this for greed. I'm doing this for my team. I'm doing this for my children's future. This is incredibly powerful because it reframes a corrupt act as an act of love or loyalty. It turns the cheater into a noble protector.
It's so seductive. It actually makes you feel like a hero for breaking the rules. You're the one willing to get your hands dirty for the good of the tribe.
But there's another deeper layer here that's driving this kind of economic rationalization, and it's a psychological principle called equity theory.
Is this the basic idea that input should equal output, that things should be fair?
Yes. Humans have a deep, almost primal need for equity. We believe that if we put in X amount of work, our input, we deserve to get Y amount of reward, our output. When that equation balances, we feel content. The world makes sense.
But what happens when it doesn't? What happens when you work really hard, but the algorithm or the market doesn't give you the reward you feel you've earned?
You feel cheated. You feel an intense imbalance. And psychologically, that creates a state we call inequity distress. And to resolve that distress, we feel we're entitled to balance the scales ourselves. If the system didn't give me the reward I worked for, I am now psychologically justified in taking it. This is what's known as justified malfeasance. Marcus doesn't see himself as a thief.
Right.
He sees himself as an agent of justice, correcting a cosmic error.
It's the strategic adjustment my friend mentioned at the coffee shop. He's just fixing the universe's faulty math.
Yeah.
The market is unfair, therefore I have to lie to make it fair.
But look at the systemic result of that thinking. As the story you told points out, this leads directly to the death of meritocracy.
We have a source here on the career of doctorate holders that gives a really strict, clean definition of meritocracy. Ability plus effort equals success.
Right, it's a simple, powerful formula. And meritocracy relies entirely on objective standards. Can you actually do the job? Did you hit the sales target? Is the code clean and efficient? But in Marcus's world, context has completely overridden objective metrics. If performance becomes a narrative competition, who has the best excuse, who can point to the most unique challenges, who has the most compelling sob story, then actual competence becomes irrelevant.
It just becomes a competition of storytelling. The best fiction writer gets the bonus, not the best engineer.
And this creates what you could call a bottom-up corruption. It's not just one bad CEO making a terrible decision. It's a structural rot where the incentives of the system itself force everyone to become a rationalizer. It creates a community of fate.
What do you mean by that, a community of fate?
It means that if Marcus tries to be the one honest person, he doesn't just hurt himself, he hurts the entire team. He sinks everyone's bonus. So the group pressure, that social cocoon, it forces him to suppress his own moral compass just to survive and to protect his peers.
It creates a system where being honest is a competitive disadvantage. If everyone else is correcting the algorithm and you're the one guy reporting the real lower numbers, you're not just honest, you're a sucker. You're the one who looks bad and gets fired.
And that is how an economy begins to rot. Not always from the top down, but from the rationalization up.
So we've seen the state dissolving into anomie because of political necessity. We've seen the economy dissolving into corruption because of equity adjustments. Now let's hit the third and final pillar, culture. And specifically how this mechanism plays out in our universities and in the sphere of identity politics. This brings us to the story of Sarah.
This one is often the most heated and controversial area, but I think you'll see that the psychological mechanisms are identical to the first two stories.
Sarah is a young, brilliant professor at a university. She's popular with her students, her research is published, but she was recently denied tenure. Now, usually tenure denial is about a lack of research or consistently poor teaching reviews. But in Sarah's case, the tenure committee openly admitted her record was stellar. Her crime was her insistence on teaching a classical liberal curriculum.
Meaning she was teaching multiple conflicting viewpoints on sensitive topics.
Yes, exactly. She included perspectives in her syllabus that some students found harmful or unsettling. She encouraged students to debate controversial topics without telling them what the right conclusion was. She believed in that old school idea of the university as a marketplace of ideas, even the uncomfortable ones.
But the tenure committee was clearly operating from a different rule book.
A completely different one, driven by certain currents in contemporary identity politics. They rationalized her removal not as an act of censorship, because that's a dirty word, but as a necessary measure for student safety and inclusivity. They argued in their official report that the subjective trauma of certain student groups outweighed the abstract principle of free speech.
Just notice the weighting of those words there. The tangible feeling of trauma versus a mere abstract principle.
It's a powerful framing. They use the language of compassion and safety to dismantle the principle of procedural fairness. In their narrative, Sarah wasn't a scholar being silenced. She was a contextual obstacle to creating a more equitable environment. They didn't see themselves as inquisitors. They genuinely saw themselves as protectors.
A contextual obstacle, that phrase is, it's chilling because of how cleanly it dehumanizes her. She's not a person anymore. She's a problem to be solved.
And by prioritizing the emotional landscape of the present moment over these universal ethical standards, they effectively dissolved the very norms that are supposed to protect academic inquiry from politics. And this story is so difficult because the stated intentions, inclusivity, safety, are things we all generally value. Nobody wants students to feel unsafe.
But this gets to the idea of the acidic solvent that was mentioned in the audience feedback. When we allow subjective victimhood to become the ultimate arbiter of who gets to speak or who gets treated fairly, it can destroy the shared reality we need to function as a society. It's a fundamental shift from the question, is this true, to how does this make us feel?
This brings us directly to the concept of the politics of victimhood. We have some sources here from sociologists like Campbell and Manning who describe this massive shift in our underlying moral culture. They argue we are moving from what they call a culture of dignity to a culture of victimhood.
We should probably define those terms carefully. What do they mean by dignity culture?
In a dignity culture, which they'd say was dominant for much the 20th century, your worth is internal. It's about your character, your actions. You are expected to have a thick skin. If someone offends you, the noble thing to do is either brush it off or resolve it privately. You know, the sticks and stones ethos. The ideal is to be unshakable and self-reliant.
Right. But in a victimhood culture, that dynamic completely flips. Social status and moral authority are no longer derived from your internal strength or your achievements. They are derived from your status as a victim. It's an external validation.
So the more you have suffered or the more marginalized your group identity is, the more moral weight your voice carries in any given argument.
Correct. And this connects very deeply to a much older idea from the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. His concept of slave morality.
Okay, Nietzsche can be heavy. Let's try to break this down simply. We aren't calling people slaves here, to be clear.
No. Slave morality is a technical philosophical term. Nietzsche argued that historically you had a master morality. Think of the values of ancient Rome or Homeric Greece. In that system, things like strength, power, capability, and success were considered good. Weakness was simply bad.
A very straightforward value system.
But he argued that with the rise of Judeo-Christian ethics, and later secularized in many modern progressive movements, this value system was completely flipped on its head. It was a transvaluation of values.
It inverted.
Yes. Weakness, suffering, and humility became rebranded as good, virtuous, and even holy. And conversely, strength, privilege, and power became branded as evil or oppressive.
So in this new system, if you are strong or successful, you are inherently morally suspect. And if you are weak or oppressed, you are inherently virtuous.
That's the core of the inversion. And the driving psychological force behind it, according to Nietzsche, is ressentiment. It's a French term, but it's much more than just resentment. It's a deep-seated, simmering, revengeful attitude that disguises itself as a demand for justice. It's not just, I want equality, it's, I want to tear down the powerful because their very existence makes me feel small.
And how does all this connect back to Sarah and the tenure committee?
The committee is operating within a culture that has created a marketplace of competitive victimhood. Different groups compete to establish who is the true victim in any situation, because that status confers power. The power to silence others, the power to bypass procedural fairness, the power to define reality. Sarah, by representing abstract principles like free speech, is seen as representing the old, powerful order, the hegemony. Therefore, she must be the enemy.
Right. They didn't just say, we disagree with Sarah's ideas. That would sound petty or ideological. They said, Sarah is causing trauma.
Yeah.
They framed her as an oppressor and the students as her victim.
Exactly. And once that frame is locked in, the rationalization kicks into high gear. Suddenly, free speech and procedural fairness are dismissed as mere tools of the oppressor. And therefore, dismantling those tools is not censorship, it's social justice, it's harm reduction.
That is the acidic solvent. The subjective feeling of harm overrides any universal principle. If I feel harmed by your words, then you are guilty, regardless of your intent or any objective facts of the matter.
And just like Julian in Brussels and Marcus in Silicon Valley, the committee members do not see themselves as villains. They are relying on a psychological mechanism called moral disengagement. They have effectively dehumanized Sarah. She isn't a colleague with a different point of view anymore. She is an obstacle. She's a vector of harm. And once you label someone an obstacle to safety, you don't have to treat them with fairness. You have bypassed the moral impulse to treat her as a fellow human being.
Together, we have Julian, the elite bureaucrat, hiding data to protect the institution. We have Marcus in the economy, faking numbers to protect his team. We have the tenure committee in the culture, silencing a professor to protect the students. They all look so different. You know, a suit in Brussels, a hoodie in Silicon Valley, tweed on a university campus, but they're all running the exact same operating system.
It's the operating system of moral rationalization. And the really scary part is just how effective it is at protecting our own ego, our own self-image.
Let's look at that toolkit directly. We've mentioned the intuitive lawyer, but why is the human brain so good at lying to itself? Why can't we just look in the mirror and admit we're doing something wrong?
It really starts with the concept of cognitive dissonance, which was famously coined by Leon Festinger. We all carry around a self-image. I am a good person, I am an honest person, I am a fair and inclusive person. But sometimes our actions contradict that image. We lie, we cheat, we censor someone. This contradiction creates an intense psychological tension, dissonance.
It's physically uncomfortable. Your brain doesn't like holding two opposing ideas at once.
It hates it. And we are hardwired to reduce that pain. So we have two choices. Choice A is to change the behavior. Stop lying, stop cheating, confess. It might cost us the bonus or a job or the election. So we usually go with choice B.
Which is?
Change the attitude toward the behavior.
We reframe reality. I didn't lie, I contextualized, I didn't cheat, I corrected for systemic bias.
This also connects to what's called self-affirmation theory. At a very basic level, we are desperate to maintain positive self-regard. We need to see ourselves as the hero of our own story. So our brain works backward. It decides the conclusion first. I need to fire Sarah, or I need this bonus. And then our intuitive lawyer goes on a manhunt for any piece of evidence, any theory, any justification to support that conclusion. Oh, she's unsafe. Oh, the market is unfair. We find the legal precedent in our own minds to justify what we want to do all along.
It sounds like being intelligent doesn't protect you from this at all. In fact, my friend at the coffee shop was an incredibly smart guy.
That's the real danger. The smarter you are, the better you are at arguing. You have a bigger vocabulary. You can use complex words like hegemony or systemic risk or narrative management. A simpler person might just say, I stole the money. A very smart person can write a 10-page dissertation on why their theft was actually a profound critique of late-stage capitalism. Intelligence just gives you a much better public relations department inside your own head.
Which leads us to the darkest part of our source material. We've been talking about corruption, censorship, data breaches. It's bad stuff for sure, but is it civilization ending? But one of our key sources, Zygmunt Bauman, takes this logic of rationalization all the way to the end of the line. He takes it to the Holocaust.
This is where we have to stop and really, really listen. Because Bauman's central thesis in his book, Modernity and the Holocaust, is absolutely shattering. We have this tendency to think of the Holocaust as a breakdown of civilization, a regression to barbarism, the angry mob taking over.
We think of it as an explosion of primitive, irrational hatred, the madness of the crowds.
Bauman says no. He says the Holocaust was not a failure of civilization. It was a product of civilization. It was, in his words, a test of modernity. And modernity passed that test with flying colors.
That is a horrific thought. How could it possibly be a product of civilization?
Think about all the tools we've been discussing. Bureaucracy, the division of labor, technical responsibility replacing moral responsibility, the gardening state. The Nazis didn't just kill people in a fit of rage. They built modern factories. They had project managers. They had railway timetables. They used the same rational, efficient, bureaucratic principles that we use to run our hospitals and our schools to run death camps.
So the man stamping the papers for the trains.
He wasn't killing anyone. He was managing logistics. He was ensuring the trains ran on time. The chemist who developed Zyklon B. He was solving a technical problem of efficient fumigation. The bureaucrat who wrote the laws defining who was a Jew. He was clarifying legal categories. By breaking the singular act of mass murder down into thousands of tiny technical rational steps, by adiaphorizing it, they allowed thousands of normal, educated, good people to participate in a historic monstrosity without ever feeling personally responsible for the final outcome.
They rationalized it away. I'm just doing my job. I'm just following orders. I'm simply protecting the German people from the weed that doesn't fit in our national garden.
Exactly. It creates what one researcher called a sleeping hero inside everyone. There's a fascinating study by Inequity on the rescuers, the people who actually hid Jews and risked their own lives. You would expect them to be the most educated, the most religious, the most civilized people.
You would think they'd be the ones with the best philosophical arguments for doing the right thing.
But they weren't. They were completely random. Poor farmers, rich aristocrats, educated professors, illiterate shopkeepers. The only thing they really had in common was that they didn't rationalize. They didn't stop to look at the context. They didn't calculate the strategic risk to themselves. They just saw a human being in need, and they acted on a pre-social instinctual responsibility for the other. They didn't let the complex machinery of bureaucracy override their basic humanity.
So, rationality, this thing we prize so much, the thing my friend at the coffee shop was so proud of mastering, was actually the weapon.
Rationalization was the weapon. It allowed the perpetrators to sleep soundly at night. It allowed them to view mass murder as a sanitation project or a national security measure. It allowed them to turn off their conscience by appealing to some higher necessity.
And the terrible irony is, we think we're so much better today. We think, oh, we'd never do something like that. But we have an even more complex language of justification now. We have equity and safety and pragmatism and stakeholder management.
That's the high-tech shield your friend was using. We are incredibly good at using complex, virtuous-sounding language to hide simple, selfish cowardice. We think we are more moral because our vocabulary has become more sophisticated. But Bauman's ultimate warning is this, that very sophistication is exactly what allows us to distance ourselves from the moral reality of our actions.
We've spent the last hour dissecting how bureaucrats, employees, and activists rationalize their actions. It's easy to judge them. It's easy to look at Julian, Marcus, and the tenure committee and just shake our heads. But the science suggests that the smarter you are, the better you are at being an intuitive lawyer for your own ego. The most dangerous lies aren't the ones we tell others. They are the ones we tell ourselves to preserve the image of our own goodness. So here is the thought I want to leave you with. If you can rationalize anything by appealing to context, loyalty, or safety, then do you actually have a conscience? Or you just have a really talented public relations department in your head?